They literally walk with God. They behave like God.
Then we go to verse 24. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When we have in the Bible this phrase, walk with God, that means that they were doing everything what God verbally told them to do. They were so connected with God that everything they did it with God.
Now the Bible says in 1 John 4 and verse 8 that God is love. Love is who God is. And Romans 13 and verse 10 tells us that love is the fulfilling of the law. So if God is love and love fulfills the law, then God's very character is the law, the Ten Commandments. Now the Bible says in Amos 3 and verse 3 that two cannot walk together except they agree. So it would really be silly for Enoch and Noah to walk with God and not agree with his Ten Commandments, the very being and character of God.
Since the Sabbath is a part of the Ten Commandments, we can't disconnect it from the other 9 as much as they try to. So if the Sabbath didn't exist from creation until Sinai, then none of the other 9 did. But the reality is that we could find all 10, including the Sabbath, in Genesis and Exodus prior to the giving of the law at Sinai.
So if we go to Exodus chapter 16, it's powerful to see that in Exodus 16, we see the children of Israel, they're out there whining and complaining because they're hungry and when we were in Egypt, we had all this food, but now we're out here and God's brought us out here to starve. And so they basically start whining and complaining, and God sends a message to Moses and he says, look, I'm going to feed my people, but first I'm going to test them.
And then God says, I want to see if they're going to follow my commandments or not. Well, what commandments were they following?
We see that 4 chapters before in Exodus 16, God is saying, on the 7th day, I'm not going to rain any manna from heaven because they are to rest on that day, and they are to gather a double portion on the 6th day to prepare them for the Sabbath rest that I'm going to give them.
Well, wait a minute now. Keep in mind, this is Exodus 16. How is it that the idea of the Sabbath was already there, obviously before the Sabbath was given on Mount Sinai at Exodus 20? That's because the Sabbath had been established from the 7th day of creation, and it had been recurring weekly ever since.
Another clear example of the Sabbath before Sinai is found in Exodus 5:5, where it reads, And Pharaoh said, Behold, the people of the land now are many, and ye make them to rest from their burdens.
And ye make them rest from their burdens. The key word is rest. So now this was right after Moses fled into the wilderness for 40 years and then came back because God commanded him to go back to free the Israelites. The first thing God had Moses do was to reinstitute the Sabbath rest for the people of Israel because they were working too much.
How do we know that that word rest is referring to the Sabbath? Well, if you look it up in the original Hebrew, that word is Shabbat, which means Sabbath.
The Pharaoh knew that the Sabbath was a day of rest. In some kind of way, perhaps they had other beliefs about God's, but definitely everybody understood that Sabbath specifically meant rest.
This goes all the way back to even the time of Abraham in the book of Genesis, where it actually says that, Abraham kept my commandments.
Chapter 26 and verse 5, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, and my statutes, and my laws. Genesis chapter 39, it mentions there that Potiphar's wife makes a move on Joseph, and she invites him to lie with me. And his response is telling. It says, how then should I commit this grave sin against God? And as we know, sin is the transgression of the law. Now, if the law didn't exist, then Abraham would have had nothing to keep, and there would have been nothing here for Joseph to realize that this was a sin.
When we go to Genesis chapter 4, we see that the Cain killed his brother. Why would God charge him if he explicitly didn't give him this commandment that you should not kill?
Of course, if there was no law at that time that they needed to follow, why would God come and question Cain about the fact that he had just killed his brother?
God came looking for him and said, what is this thing that you have done? It says there that Cain slew his brother. And so the laws have already been there from the very inception, from the very beginning, including the Sabbath.
And when you look at Genesis, the story of Noah, where God looks upon the earth and realizes that the whole world, there is nothing but evil in their hearts of all men. except for one man.
So even though the text does not explicitly say right there in Genesis 6, 7, 8, or 9, during that story or that flood story of Noah, we know that the people were evil in their hearts. Their thoughts were evil continually, according to the first few verses of